I'd like to now introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Finkelstein. He is an American political scientist, author, and commentator known most for his work on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and of his critique of the political uses of the Holocaust. As the son of Holocaust survivors, Professor Finkelstein was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and he earned his PhD from Princeton University in 1988. Over the course of his career, he has taught at several academic institutions, DePaul, NYU, Rutgers, and many more. And he has spent time in the West Bank, living amongst the Palestinians, and he has first-hand experiences in just what happens out there.
Because time is somewhat limited, I'm going to stick to just discussing 3 topics of the moment rather than going into the history. I've spoken so much on it, and through the miracle of YouTube, for better or for worse, you get to hear me at most of my remarks. And so I imagine that most people here are already familiar with my viewpoints on what happened October 7th, the events that preceded October 7th, and pretty much up to the near present. I would just say as one passing remark that occurred to me, and here there may be real disagreements with the audience. I was listening to the other day to Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders' denunciation of Donald Trump. And among the things that he denounced President Trump for was the fact that Trump accused Ukraine of being the aggressor in the armed hostilities between Ukraine and Russia. And Bernie Sanders kept reiterating, we all know who started the war. We all know who launched the attack. And whatever you think about the situation in Ukraine, it struck me that that's exactly the same refrain that was used on October 7th. We all know who launched the attack. We all know who is the aggressor. And to my mind, it was a repetition of that situation, namely the willful refusal to look at the sequence of events that led up, in one case, to the Russian attack on Ukraine in February, I guess 22nd, 2021, and 2022, yes, because it's 3 years now, February 2022, and similarly, the refusal, the calculated refusal to look at the sequence of events that climaxed in the Hamas action on October 7th. And I would say, well, not in any attempt at any desire at disparagement, it seemed that, to my thinking at any rate, Senator Sanders made the same error twice over. He was quite awful in the first weeks after October 7th. Took him about a couple of months for his eyes to be opened. And he remains, in my opinion, quite awful on the question of Ukraine. One could reasonably argue that Russia shouldn't have launched that attack, but I don't think it can be reasonably argued that there were a sequence of gross provocations that climaxed in the Russian attack whether the provocations had crossed the threshold justifying an attack, or whether the sequence of events that climaxed on October 7th justified what happened on October 7th. In either case, it's simply completely dishonest, in my opinion, intellectually and politically dishonest to efface, to wipe out the whole history preceding October 7th or preceding February 22nd. That was just a side remark. I'm going to deal with 3 topics this evening. The first topic is what's happening in Gaza a genocide? Now, there have been 2, what you might call, I don't like the expression because it's one of these idiotic postmodern expressions, but there have been 2 framings of October 7th. The first framing is the one that everybody in this room is familiar with, and it's the framing that has dominated, monopolized, not just dominated, monopolized the media, namely that what happened from October 7th to the present has been an Israel-Hamas war. That's how it is, routinely, to the point of, you could say, 0 exceptions. That's how it's to be characterized, an Israel-Hamas war. Now, beginning, you could say, in January 2024, there was an attempt made, in this case by South Africa, to reframe what was happening on from October 7th forward. South Africa, on December 29th, 2023, it submitted what's called an application to the International Court of Justice. And the application, it ran through, well, I'll get to that in a moment. The essence of the application was that Israel was in violation of the Genocide Convention of 1948. And so South Africa was formally, you might say, declaring, no, this is not a war. This is a genocide. Something very different. And the International Court of Justice found in January 2024 that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza. It didn't make a final determination. I don't want to overburden the audience, you, with technicalities, but this is, I think, fairly easy to explain. The court couldn't make a determination at that point as to whether Israel was committing a genocide because all of the evidence hadn't yet been submitted. They didn't have time yet to read carefully the evidence. And so the purpose of the January meeting of the court was simply very simple. Is Israel plausibly committing a genocide such that we should, the technical term is indicate, such that we should indicate provisional measures in order to prevent the genocide before we have time to thoroughly read the evidence. So the court at that point had only, but it's not trivial, had concluded that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide. So now you had, as it were, two contending descriptions or analyses of what actually was happening in Gaza. Was it a war? And a war denotes something pretty straightforward. You have two armies, at minimum two, obviously it could be more. You have two armies in combat, and the purpose of the war is for one side or the other to inflict a military defeat on the other side. You want to disable your enemy's army. That's a war. Now, it's true, and everybody in this room knows it, that sometimes in wars, the combatants or the combatants on both sides, they do kill civilians, and sometimes they even target civilians. And sometimes they engage in terror tactics in order to inflict a psychological blow on the enemy in order to speed up a defeat on the other side. That's all true. Nobody's going to be so silly or naive as to deny that A, civilians get killed in a war, and B, it's not infrequently the case that civilians are targeted in what you might call a terror campaign in order to speed up a victory. However, that being said, the bottom line remains the same. In a war, you want to inflict a military defeat on your enemy. A genocide is very different. You're not trying to inflict a military defeat on your enemy. You're trying to destroy the civilian population. It's not as if killing civilians is collateral damage. It's not as if killing civilians is an additional tactic, the terror assault, in order to achieve a military victory. No, it's something very different. You're not trying to defeat your enemy's military. You're trying to destroy the civilian population. And so, it's very critical which description is being attached in any particular situation. When you say, or as it has been said, uniformly, without any exception, because it was an editorial decision that was made by the dominant media, it was an individual and collective decision made that we are going to characterize what has been unfolding. We're going to characterize it as a war. Well, that characterization is, from the Israeli point of view, winning 99% of the propaganda war. The moment you characterize it as an Israel-Hamas war, they have won 99% of the, so to speak, ideological battle. It's a very different thing, as I'm sure everybody in this room recognizes. It's a very different thing had the media adopted the South African point of view. That in fact what was happening in Gaza was a genocide. Now, I would add to that, as I've already indicated, it wasn't just the South African point of view. The mainstream media persisted till this day in describing what's happening in Gaza as a war, even as the supreme judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, had reached the tentative conclusion that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. So when the entire range of the media, and I don't just mean in the United States, you can look at the BBC, you can look at the French, everyone, the entire so-called civilized world, consciously, willfully adopted that description of what's happening in Gaza. So, my first point is there was a conscious decision made. And that conscious decision colored in very significant ways how everybody perceived what was happening in Gaza. Because it seemed, based on that description, that the focus of Israel's actions was to inflict a military defeat on Hamas. And it seemed, because that description was adopted, that most of the, so to speak, action was occurring between Israel and Hamas, even though just the most superficial examination of the facts tells you otherwise. So, let's just take two simple, I could say, uncontroversial facts. Fact number one, on average, between October 7th and today, or I should say, because I don't want to get caught on technicalities, on average, between October 8th and today, less than one Israeli soldier has been killed in Gaza each day. Now, I hope that number sinks in for you. Less than one Israeli soldier has been killed each day. So then you have to ask yourself the question, if less than one Israeli soldier has been killed each day, does that, to your mind, sound like a war? Does that sound like a war to you? Fact number two, which everybody in this room knows by omission. What do I mean by that? Is there anyone in this room that can name one battle that occurred in Gaza? One battle, one major engagement in which significant numbers of Israeli casualties resulted. One. There are no battles in Gaza. It's just not true. It's not a fault or a disgrace to Hamas resistance in Gaza. There was no possibility for a battle. For anybody who followed what was going on the ground, if you remember, Israel didn't launch its ground invasion until 3 weeks after October 7th. And you know why? Because they were proceeding to pulverize everything in sight before the ground troops entered. It was not possible for there to be a military resistance because everything in front of the Israeli troops as they advanced into Gaza, everything had been reduced to dust. So, in the face of those two uncontroversial facts, less than one Israeli soldier killed each day, no major battles, it doesn't seem plausible that what was happening in Gaza was a war. However, now let's look at the competing conception of what's going on in Gaza, or has gone on, that it's a genocide. In my view, and I don't think it's at this point subject to controversy, in my view, the evidence, because remember that the International Court of Justice is making its judgment in January, that's over a year ago. And now there has been a huge accumulation of documentary evidence. We can begin, and I'm only beginning, we can begin with the South African application. It ran to 84 single-spaced pages. It had over 500 footnotes, and each footnote had multiple references. Now, already, that's a pretty impressive document. But there are two other aspects, or one other aspect of that document that bears mentioning. Most of you here are of the web age, where you can Google any topic. The world is flat. The moon is made of green cheese, and so forth. Elon Musk is a humble man. You can Google anything, and you know what? Because of the miracle of the web, you can come up with 1,000 references in the blink of an eye to prove your contention. So, you could say, okay, granted what Professor Finkelstein just said is true, 500 footnotes, multiple references in each footnote. You could say, yeah, but you can find proof of that for anything. And, you have to be honest, it's true. But there's one big difference that separates out the South African document. The difference is all of their references are to the most respectable humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations in the world. They did not make references to marginal groups, to kooky groups, to groups which didn't have a track record. No. Who did they refer to? When they were trying to document this genocide in Gaza, they used the World Health Organization, the United Nations Development Program, UNICEF, UNESCO, CARE, Save the Children, USAID, AID. Palestine references, in order to dispute or deny the contention of South Africa that Israel was plausibly committing genocide, you would have to say that all those organizations were lying. And is that plausible? Is it plausible that UNICEF, Save the Children, World Health Organization, and 100 other UN humanitarian organizations, that they're all lying? That they're all collaborating, colluding in an anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying conspiracy? Is that believable? And then we have to look at the other side. The other side, what did Israel present in its defense? And when you look at what they presented, it was with a couple of exceptions. They were just citing statements by the Israeli government or statements by Israeli institutions. And so now you have to use your judgment. There's an expression in law, it's called evidence against interest. Evidence against interest. What does that mean? Very simple concept, everybody here understands it. If Hitler said there were no gas chambers, you would say, oh, that's of course he would say that. But Hitler said there were gas chambers. That's against his interest to make that admission. And so it's a standard in law to attach more evidentiary value, evidence value, to statements which are not in your interest. Why do I mention this? Because the only evidence Israel was able to cite, with a couple of exceptions, but we're talking about very marginal exceptions, the only evidence they were able to cite was evidence with interest. Namely, the Israeli government had an interest in denying that it was using starvation as a weapon of war. Israel had an interest in denying that it was targeting journalists. Israel had an interest in denying that it was targeting medics. Israel had an interest in denying that hospitals were being targeted. But what interest did the World Health Organization have in saying that Israel was targeting medics? Israel was targeting hospitals. It should, I think, be obvious they had no interest, those organizations. And so when you weigh the evidence, it seems to me that South Africa prevails, really, with no enemy in the field. Now, were what I was saying untrue, you would have a difficulty explaining one other fact about those hearings before the International Court of Justice. I don't want to get, as I say, into all the technicalities, but there were hearings in January, new hearings in February, new hearings in March, and then new hearings in May, because Israel was not relenting in its genocidal assault. So South Africa kept going before the International Court of Justice, trying to get them to, what's called, indicate more measures to slow down Israel's assault. So here's the point. When I first heard that South Africa was going before the court, I said, this is the most ridiculous thing in the world. Can you possibly believe the International Court of Justice, where the president at the time, Joan Donahue, was an American? The Americans held the presidency at the time, where Germany, which would never criticize Israel, was sitting on the court, where France and Great Britain would never break ranks with the US, was also sitting on the court. And I went through each country and I said, forget it, this is hopeless. What a waste of time. I was completely shocked by the result, because the result was, the vote was 15-1. If you wanted an amusing footnote, the one was a judge from Uganda, who I suspect got a nice sized diamond ring out of it. That is a vacation. In any event, how did that happen? I was so off base in my prediction, my analysis. The reason was actually quite simple. The reason was the International Court of Justice is the supreme legal arm of the United Nations. And South Africa came up with a very clever strategy. In our document, we're only going to cite United Nations organizations. So, to vote no would be to say, we think all UN organizations are lying, which is not really tenable for the supreme legal body of the United Nations. And so South Africa, I believe, very cleverly trapped the ICJ in a positive way, using UN organizations, trapped them, and they had to acknowledge there's a plausible genocide going on. Now, that was January 2024. A lot of water has passed under the bridge. Amnesty International put out a 250-page report. Very exhaustive. I've read Amnesty reports since long before most of you in the room were born. The quality is generally uneven. I would say this time the quality was first rate. It was a 250-page report, very large for a human rights organization. What did it conclude? Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. They didn't have the qualification plausibly, because this is much later. The Amnesty report comes out about 3/4 of a year later. Human Rights Watch puts out a report. What does it conclude? It concludes that Israel is committing acts of extermination and acts of genocide. In addition, there have been many independent scholars. One in particular, Lee Mordechai, he has his PhD from Princeton University in Byzantium studies, and he knows how to research. And he's currently a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He puts out his own independent study, just voluminously cataloging the genocidal acts and incitements to genocide in Gaza. So I would say, in conclusion on that point, I would say two things. Number one, I think one can reasonably say now, without the qualification of plausible, I think one can reasonably say now that Israel has been committing a genocide in Gaza. And number two, And it follows from number one. And number two, the categorization of what's been happening in Gaza is A, based on the factual evidence, clearly false. There has been no war to speak of in Gaza. And number two, it's a calculated, premeditated disinformation designed to enable Israel's victory in the propaganda war. Everybody in this room understands that the New York Times, it's CBS, NBC, ABC, and all the other affiliates, if they said, this is month 14 in Israel's genocide in Gaza, it would resonate very differently than saying, this is month 14, it's 16, I'm aware, month 16 in Israel's war with Hamas. It would communicate, it would transmit an altogether different image of what's happening there. And I want to stress, to describe it as a genocide is not an act of propaganda. It's a factual question, whether it is or isn't, whether it does or doesn't constitute a genocide. And I say, and I repeat, that the ICJ, the highest judicial body in the world, said it was plausible in January, and since then, there has been a mountain of evidence. In fact, the South Africans have now submitted their second major document for the actual proceedings, and it runs to 750 pages with 4,000 pages. Yes, you heard it here. 4,000 pages of supplementary documentation. And one of the dreads I'm filled with at this point in my life, there are two. My imminent mortality, and two, having to read that document in its release. So, I don't think those are, I do feel obliged to read it. Oh, God only knows I don't want to. Maybe on the way home, there'll be a car crash. I want the driver to live, but... Let me turn to the second question, which in my opinion has not been sufficiently digested by people who have lent their hearts and their bodies to the cause of the people of Gaza. And that is, I feel as if there's a kind of mental schizophrenia going on. Because people, yourselves, you recite in graphic detail the horrors that have been inflicted on the people and on the landscape of Gaza, and yet are unwilling, in my opinion, to take in the consequences of the horror that was inflicted. What do I mean by that? I think at this moment there is a real moral and political dilemma. When President Trump says there is nothing left in Gaza, it looks like a demolition zone. He is, whether one likes it or not, he is speaking to the facts. There is nothing left in Gaza. If you drop, as it's been said, I haven't looked at the specific documentation, but it sounds plausible to me. If you would drop the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs on Gaza, an area that's 26 miles long, the length of a marathon, and 5 miles wide, which is the length I jog at my age along Coney Island seashore, in a parcel of land 26 miles long and 5 miles wide, if you drop the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs, how much can be left? Well, we have very good data now, through the miracles of satellite photography and things like that. There are 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza. The estimate is, if you allow in 100 trucks a day to remove the rubble, and I don't believe there's a snowball's chance in hell that Israel will allow 100 trucks in a day, but if you did, it would take a minimum of 15 years just to clear out the rubble. For most of you in this room, you're probably about the age of 20. That means it will take you, yes. Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, I misunderstood the note, I see. It will take you from your age of 5 to your current age of 20, that much time to clear out the rubble. Now, we're not talking about reconstruction. We're just talking about clearing out the rubble, which is mixed in with all this unexploded ordnance and toxic substances. The estimate is 92% of the homes in Gaza, 92% have been destroyed or seriously damaged. 2/3 of the infrastructure, hospitals, water, sewage plants, electrical plants, 2/3 have been destroyed. There is in my opinion, a serious question about what exactly do you advocate now? There are 2 million people there. There is no future in the raw physical sense. And we have to always, in my opinion, we have to always be careful about imposing our political agendas and dreams on other people. They are the ones who have to face the consequences of the horror that was inflicted on them. And we have to be very careful to allow them to make the choice about how they, not us, wish to go forward. So, I do believe that it's a difficult situation. So far, there have been 2 options presented. Mr. Trump's option, which doesn't need, no point in squandering time on it. And then there's what's called the Arab option, the one presented by the head of state of Egypt, which speaks about reconstruction. I think there's very good grounds to be very skeptical about that proposal. Right now, the Egyptian government has handed over responsibility for trucks entering Gaza into an individual who demands a $20,000 bribe on each truck that goes in. Is that really an option for the people of Gaza, that Egypt be responsible for its reconstruction? I'll let you decide that one for yourself. But I don't think much of the money is going to end up in the hands of the people of Gaza. If they are designated the organization, the state responsible for its reconstruction. I'm waiting personally to hear what the United Nations will propose, whether there will be a proposal coming from organizations which know the lay of the land, know it's a realistic possibility. And then it's, as I said, up to the people to decide how they want to proceed. I've been asked to stop now, which is perfectly reasonable to give you a chance. I wanted to speak on one other topic, which is the most pressing. You're an audience overwhelmingly of activists, and you want to know what should we do now. And I will just say briefly, and then I'll leave it to you to ask me to elaborate. I think now there has been a decisive falling off of interest in Gaza, and there has been a crackdown, unprecedented in American history, a crackdown, a suppression, a repression of academic freedom on our campuses in order to kill the spirit that inspired the spring encampments. So in my view, there is now a convergence between two issues, namely Free Gaza, which was the animating force, spiritual force behind the spring encampments, and free speech, the right of you to speak your minds and act on your minds on your college campus. And so I think the best slogan right now would be Free Gaza, Free Speech. Because that slogan is not only accurate, but it has a much bigger chance of bringing in that broad community which lost some interest, both because of the repression that was exerted and also because there is currently formally a ceasefire in place. And I'll just say one last word, which is my experience from a long life involved in politics is that one has to always be very cautious and careful, for lack of a better word, of the ultras, those who have radical sounding slogans, but whether intentionally, or as they say, wittingly or unwittingly, the only consequence of those radical sounding slogans is to alienate the broad population that you're trying to reach. Sometimes it's just moral posturing, trying to show that you're more radical than everyone else. And sometimes it's just agents provocateurs, people whose aim is, because they're paid, their aim is to sow dissension and confusion in the movement. So I believe we have to be very careful about not playing into the hands of those who, willingly or not, will destroy the movement. And I've noticed everywhere, because I've talked to many campus organizations across the country, and I've heard from every single group I talk to, that there has been not only the external repression that began in the spring and continues to this day, there's that additional problem of factionalism and fragmentation among the hardcore who stayed in the movement. Okay, that's That's it, and now on to you.
This is cruelty. This is not war. That's what the Pope said recently. And I'm hearing that you're on board with the Pope as he hangs in with his life.
Hi, my name is Anya. Thank you so much for talking. I don't know if I would consider this a dissent, but I would like to get your opinion about the efficacy of the United Nations. And although a lot of the work that they do is reputable, I mean, I'm sure that there is stuff to be said about how to improve that. And so I'd just like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
It happens, and this was not planned between the questioner and myself, that I have been working on a book entitled Gaza's Grave Diggers, an Inquiry into Corruption in High Places. And it's mostly, I want to say nearly entirely, about corruption at the United Nations that has impeded any positive, or has impeded positive developments there. So I am the last one to defend the record of the UN. But there are aspects that it seems to me are worthy of defense. The UN obviously did not do everything it could during these past 16 months. But it is true to say that Secretary General Gutierrez, obviously the head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, the Undersecretary of State for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, I think it is true to say, at least verbally, they were very good. Now, people inside the UN tell me they could have done more. But if you compare it to the past, that lamentable past of people like Ban Ki-moon, I think it has acquitted itself with a certain amount of honor, a certain amount. And I would say the record of the ICJ has not been bad. I would say it was quite good. However, as you know, the UN is essentially a states-oriented organization. And there's not going to be any change, significant change, unless masses of people, as they did in those first months, get involved. Unlike others, I won't believe that they had no impact. They did have an impact. Indirectly, true, they had no impact in Israel directly. They did have an impact through the Biden administration, Biden and Blinken. People forget, I believe, that Israel was very forthright about its genocidal intentions from day one. Mr. Netanyahu said, remember Amalek. And as one Israeli human rights organization put it, every Israeli student, anyone who's gone to school, knows what remember Amalek means. It means kill every man, woman, and child. It may have been an ambiguous expression here, but it was not an ambiguous expression there. If there were any doubt as to what it meant, the defense minister, Mr. Gallon, made it very clear He said we're not admitting any food, water, fuel, or electricity in Gaza. No food, no fuel, no water, no electricity. That would seem to be the perfect recipe for genocide. And if there's still any doubt, the president of Israel, Mr. Herzog, he said there's no difference between civilians and children in Gaza. Excuse me, no difference between civilians and combatants in Gaza. Now, some people said, well, they just said that the spur of the moment, the shock at what happened. That's not true. They kept repeating it day in and day out for days, then weeks, then months. There are huge dossiers assembled of thousands of statements that have been coming out from Gaza. There was no change of intention. What did happen was, because in particular of those student encampments in the spring, President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken felt the pressure such that they told Israel it had to admit some humanitarian aid. It had to admit some water and some electricity. Now you might say it was cosmetic. Yes, it was. But in my opinion, had there not been the kinds of pressure that was exerted by young people, including those in this room who attended the encampments, in my opinion, it would have been much worse, and it probably would have been over, meaning Gaza would have been gone much sooner. Is it as much pressure as one wished? Answer, no. But was it ineffective, useless, or waste? I would say to that question also, answer, no.
Hi, Doctor. I just had a quick question. So I've seen recent reports that the Trump administration is freezing or cutting off funding to the Palestinian Authority security forces. So I was curious what impact you thought that would have, if that would create a potential power vacuum, or what the possible effects that could be. And thank you for coming.
To a question like that, there are so many sides. I frankly think there's a part of me that says the Palestinian security forces, which are just adjuncts of the Israeli army and murder and torture machine, if they're defunded, I don't see any great loss there. So part of me says, let them be funded. On the other hand, if there are no security forces, then of any kind, then it's quite likely that chaos and anarchy would ensue, which would then give Israel a new excuse to further its control of the West Bank. So those are kind of what you would call borderline questions, where it depends on the judgment of those on the ground whose judgment we can trust, to see where they would stand on a question like that.
Hi, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on a one-state solution, and what would that mean if there was a one-state solution, as currently Palestine is being wiped off the maps?
I like to try to be relevant to the moment. I don't think at the moment there is any point in discussing 2 states, 1 state, no states, or 10 states. It's just not on the historic agenda right now. It's something that you might want to discuss in a graduate class seminar. But right now, realistically speaking, none of those options are on the agenda, historical agenda, because they're not realistic options. Let's say you say a one-state solution, okay? That means, as far as I can understand, that a government would comprise the surviving leaders of Hamas, together with Mr. Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu. That's one state. Does that sound plausible to anybody in this room? If it's completely devoid of any contact with reality, then why even discuss it? It doesn't, it's a kind of academic posturing that has no bearing on the question there. There are two very burning questions. How will the people of Gaza survive after the annihilation of their place of living? And number two, it's clear that the Israeli government is going to push as hard as it can to solve not just the Gaza question, but to solve the West Bank question. And solving the West Bank question will certainly include a large element of expulsion. So those seem to me to be the relevant questions right now. And they're also not easy questions to answer. So we should focus on that, and not one state, 2 states, 10 states, or no states.
Thank you so much for coming out here, Dr. Finkelstein. I wanted to ask you a question that has been plaguing me for some time, which, bear with me just for a second while I get it out there, which is that nationalism makes me deeply uncomfortable. American nationalism, white nationalism, German nationalism. Zionism is just Jewish nationalism. But at the same time, nationalism is the emotional beating heart of a lot of indigenous liberation movements. So I wanted to ask you, what is the role of nationalism in our work? And how do we avoid its worst impulses?
That's a completely fair question, and I don't think I can answer it in a substantial way, not only because of reasons of time, but because it would require a lot of thought. And the thought is, how do you respect the national aspirations of each individual people if they happen to cohabit the same parcel of land? How do you reconcile what are often conflicting aspirations, national aspirations? My view has been for a very long time that it's pointless to try to come up with some solution of my own, and rather I look at the representative bodies, institutional bodies around the world, and see how they have proposed to resolve a question like that. And unless I find their proposal completely unacceptable, I defer to their judgment. And I don't go further than that because I don't believe there's any right answer to questions like that. How do you reconcile or not reconcile, say, the national aspirations of Jews and Palestinians in that parcel of land? How do you do it? I don't think there's a single answer, and I don't think, unless you want to turn this into a graduate school seminar, I don't see any point in discussing it.
Hi, thanks for being here. I have a simple question. Who is going to hold Israel accountable if not the United States, Great Britain, or any of the other Western world countries?
I think we should maximize our effort to hold them accountable as best as we can, bearing in mind that it's not a Sisyphean labor, but it's pretty close to trying to get these folks to be held accountable. As I said, I've been working on a book to try to hold at least 4 or 5 individuals accountable. I have, I think, a small possibility of success, but I have to acknowledge I went after pretty low-level officials who I accused of being bribed or blackmailed by Israel. When you get up to the Netanyahus, Blinkens, Bidens, when you get up to that level, accountability is unlikely. And we have to, I guess, be honest about that. My credo in life, I did my best, which is the best that I can do. And that, I think, is the rational way of functioning. You do your best, but most of the factors which decide in the end, most of the factors are out of our control. That's life.
Hi. I wanted to ask, what actions do you recommend that we as student activists take to both further the goals of the movement, but also protecting people that might be more vulnerable because of certain actions being taken by the government?
Those are very practical, very good questions. My view is you should set as your goal maybe April 1st or April 15th to work in conjunction with all the other colleges that had encampments across the country. And on April 1st or April 15th, you are reestablishing those encampments. Those are your rights of freedom of speech and your right of freedom of assembly. And you're not going to let university officials or the Jewish supremacist billionaire class, which was behind the crackdown in the spring, you are not going to allow them to snatch from you your right to freedom of speech. That was what happened in the spring, was the most brazen, outrageous assault on academic freedom in our country's history. There has not even the McCarthy era came close to it. Because in those couple of months, the president of Harvard University was ousted from office. The president of University of Pennsylvania was ousted from office. A couple of months later, the president of Columbia University was ousted from office. 3 Ivy League presidents were ousted from office over the attempt or the claim that those 3 presidents have been insufficiently repressive of the right to freedom of speech. They were insufficiently repressive. And with the success that was achieved by ousting them, a shadow, a very dark shadow, descended across the country on that right to freedom of speech at college campuses. You go to many campuses now across the country, not just students, professors are terrified because they're being terrorized. They're terrified to speak about not just what's happening in Gaza, but even using a certain terminology can jeopardize, if you're a student, can jeopardize your attendance at the university, can put you in a position of maybe being deported from the country. Professors have lost their rights of tenure, which really never happens. Tenure, whatever you think of it, it's a pretty robust institution. Once you've had tenure, there are really only two grounds for expelling you. One was called moral turpitude, sleeping with a minor, say. Or two, you commit some sort of crime, felony murder. But losing tenure for saying that Israel is committing a genocide, that's very unusual. I'll just give one example that's always struck me. So there was that slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Personally, I didn't like the slogan, personally. But certainly, they had the right to say it. Why do I say that? There are some people in this room who are edging towards my age on this great spectrum of birth to death. And they will remember the most famous civil liberties case in our country in the 1980s was there was a group in the Nazi Party which wanted to march through a community of Holocaust survivors in a place called Skokie, Illinois. So that's pretty traumatic. The Nazi Party wanting to march through a community of Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. And the case went to the courts, and what do you think the court said? Under our Constitution, they had the right. And that was a landmark decision in our country. Anyone from my generation, you say Skokie, they will know it. And now, students chanting from the river to the sea were suddenly forbidden to say it because Jewish students, or some Jewish students, said they felt unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unsafe. That was an unusual standard, unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unsafe. You can imagine that the Holocaust survivors of Skokie, Illinois felt unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unsafe. Our courts ruled the Nazi Party had the right. So, a very dark shadow descended in our universities, and it's not, by any stretch of the imagination, it has not gone away. And so I believe the best strategy now, because Americans may be more in imagination than in fact, they cherish that right to freedom of speech. And I think if you start wearing T-shirts and selling them or giving them away free, on the back it says, Israel, Gaza, genocide. And the front, it says, freedom of speech. And to try to combine the emotive, that means it's going to your emotions, also your emotions, the emotive value of Gaza with the emotive value of we have that right. The right to speak your mind out. As Paul Robeson, for those of you of the old generation, remember, when he sang The House I Live In, and he was himself the subject of a rabid attack on his person and his politics. And when he sang the most famous lyric where the whole audience would break out in resounding applause, the right to speak my mind out. That's America to me. And we have to revive that feeling, remind people that a very basic right, was stolen in the spring of 2024. And guess what? We're taking it back.